In this podcast, I thought that I would talk to you about Christmas and what it means for you. Think back to your childhood and all of those happy memories you might have, hot chocolate, movies, Christmas Eve, opening your presents on Christmas Day, being with your family. Christmas for children in care can be hard enough because it brings up those memories of loss of family, loss of siblings, loss of parents, loss of all those people that they should be spending Christmas with. And then suddenly you may be left spending Christmas with random strangers. But what I want to talk to you about is the prevalence of children being removed from loving foster homes in the weeks and even the days running up to Christmas. Imagine that you've lived somewhere for 10 years or more, 6 years, 7 years, and you've built those traditions, you've built those memories, you feel safe, you feel secure, and this is your family. To suddenly have social workers turn up and rip you away from that in the weeks before Christmas, I don't believe that that's something that a young person will ever recover from. I think everybody, there's so much put upon Christmas, there's so much like emotional investment that you've got to have a good time, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. And, it's everywhere in your face from kind of November onwards. In fact, it gets earlier, doesn't it? And for some people, it's such a sad, such a lonely, such a triggering time. And I think for young people who've been removed from loving foster homes in those weeks before Christmas, and, cases that we've dealt with where it's turned out that those moves were completely unjustified, I don't think that they will ever truly, as children and into adulthood, be able to enjoy Christmas. It's going to be a shocking memory. And to be perfectly blunt, in my opinion, that is emotional abuse. The fact that they've been put through that at such a significant time is emotional abuse. So I'm going to read one of our social media posts from the 4th of December 2020. Yeah, 2020, that's significant, isn't it? Literally. Think about the year that was for everyone, including young people. The anxiety, insecurity, fear, isolation, lockdown, everything that happened during that year. And I think everybody was affected by that in some way. So this I will read to you is from the 4th of December 2020, something that we dealt with. This afternoon, social workers in the south of England will turn up after school and tell a young boy to pack a bag and leave his happy foster home of many years. He does not want to leave. The fostering service panel and the agency decision maker do not want him to leave. So I think I need to stress here, this isn't a case where there were safeguarding concerns, welfare concerns for this young person. It was a decision by a social worker that they were moving this young person regardless of every other professional's opinion. The foster carers are distraught and shell-shocked and they do not want him to leave. They didn't want him to go either. Last night and this morning they had to deceive him and act as though everything was normal, as they were told not to tell him. Can you imagine having to send a young person off to school, make their evening meals, spend the evening with them, do your normal activities, whilst knowing full well that you are lying to the face and that young person is going to be absolutely devastated later in the day? Can you imagine being put in that position? Worse still, they were told not to tell, as well as being told not to tell him, they were told not to contact his advocate who he can talk to after the move. So the significance of that is that the local authority, local authority social worker, not only moved him against all the other professionals' thoughts and feelings, and the foster carers wanted him to stay, and the boy did not want to move, and he said he didn't want to move when it was suggested. Ignoring all of those people, that social worker also chose to block that young person's right to advocacy, that young person's right to have a voice. It also goes against the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child, Article 12, right to have your feelings heard and to be listened to. So all of those things this social worker chose to block, and also bullied and intimidated the foster carers that they were not allowed to let that young person exercise their rights, their human rights. So, I've got some real issues with that we're putting in submissions to the inquiry that's looking into the rights of a child. And also in our own public inquiry work push, that is a massive issue. So, carrying on reading this post. This afternoon will be one of the worst days of his young life, as his right to self-determination, his voice and his wishes have been steamrolled over. Will he cry and beg not to go? Of course he will. And his distraught foster carers will look on in silent horror as they've been told not to speak. This was written the day that the incident, this removal was happening. I can remember writing it, and I do know what actually happened when the social workers turned up. Not only did he cry and beg not to go, he point blank refused to go. He kicked and screamed, and the social workers basically said, "Get in that car, or we are calling the police, and we might have your foster carers arrested for facilitating your refusal to leave," which they weren't doing. They were just stood telling him he had to go. But the social worker was literally turning it on the foster carer. I remember, having sleepless nights over this, along with many other child removals. So then, in spite of a glowing panel report and the support of their supervising social worker, they will no doubt walk away from fostering for good, and who can blame them? And they did. Those foster carers, they walked away. Even though they were approved to continue and they had glowing panel reports, that was the end for them. And I just think, Christmas, what a thing to do to a child and a fostering family at Christmas. And it's not the only case. Over the years, we've dealt with so many. And back in 2023, we dealt with a case where a young person was removed on the 19th of December, literally a few days before Christmas. And we did crowdfund, there was quite a lot of social media input into this, and a lot of people got involved. And one of the things that really struck me was it was completely anonymised. You could not identify the local authority, the child, the foster carers, and any of the information. And we were approached by 3 different local authorities accusing us of breaching confidentiality. So what that basically showed us was that 3 different local authorities had guilty consciences and knew that they had emotionally abused foster children in that run up to Christmas, and they thought they were being called out. Obviously, 2 of them weren't correct. Our particular social media posts and fundraising campaign did not refer to them. But, the fact that so many came forward and they were so defensive and aggressive and accusatory of something that was completely anonymised. And, I would hope that some of those people who came forward that way, who were so defensive and aggressive, went away and did some quiet reflection and some thinking about, if we are removing children on a whim, we're removing children because we've got a beef, let's call it, with the foster carers, and we are removing children anytime, let alone Christmas, birthdays, holidays, significant times of a year. How can we, how do they sleep at night? That is, honestly, I've said it and I'll say it again, it's a safeguarding concern because it's emotional abuse. They are leaving those young people scarred for life. And one of the things that we really want as part of an outcome for a public inquiry is that children who've been removed on a whim because the foster carers have made a complaint, or they've advocated too well, or they've been too professional, shall we say, and got someone's back up. And, the foster children have been punished for that. But worse than that, they won't know. They will not have been told the truth. The foster care is not allowed to contact them. They will believe that they weren't wanted, they weren't loved, they were too naughty, they were too much of a handful, the foster care didn't care about them. They're carrying those emotional scars, those wounds into adulthood. And when I met with solicitors recently and MPs, and we were discussing kind of fine-tuning public inquiry, one of the things was to be clear about the outcomes that you want. And I think one of the important outcomes has to be that when we're looking back at cases of children removed, those young people, or young adults as they may be now, are contacted and they are told the truth, and they're given counselling, they're given opportunities to heal from that rejection, that loss, that emotional abuse, that harm that was caused to them by a broken system punishing foster carers. And I think that has to be one of the biggest requirements on our public inquiry wish list, is that these wrongs for young people are made right. Because, when you're all celebrating Christmas this year, and I put this out to service managers, director of children's services, CEOs, social workers, everyone, when you are celebrating Christmas this year and you are preparing for Christmas and you are thinking about any triggers you might have from, like maybe you've lost someone around Christmas, you've a relationship's ended, and think about how that affects you. Stop for a minute and think about the harm that is being done, that lasting harm to all of those young people who were ripped away from loving homes any time of year, but particularly all these ones that have happened around Christmas. And, just stop and think, you public sector workers, you are public servants. Think about how the harm that you are doing, and reflect on whether that you need to reconsider how you handle